this town call it PDX, for God's sakes.
Yeah.
I just call it PED. Yeah.
So in
much of a
those
hurry I'm
days,
in.
it was apparently customary for postmen to deliver mail on Christmas Day, though often they were given great hospitality for doing their job on that day. They would have been offered meals and drinks at pretty much every house they called on. There was some discussion about whether or not it was actually postmen would call for tips, but I believe it was hospitality that they received, but people like rubbish men and other things that collected would expect tips on Christmas Day, which I think is fair.
Well, some people actually, even here in America today, tip their mailmen on the holidays.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah?
That's true, yeah.
Or give them a present.
Cookies and stuff like that, yeah. Larry, it is reported, had at least 2 different dinners on Christmas night.
I want to point out the number of meals that this guy has had.
Yeah.
Because to me, his state later on, as it's described, is a bit confusing.
Depends on who you ask, actually.
Yeah, some people said he was still cold sober.
But for the amount that he has eaten, it makes me always question his state of inebriation.
Well, I mean, I think you can get drunk even if you've had a ton of food. I suspect that he was also drinking while he was eating. It wasn't just sitting down to a meal, you know.
I get that. My point is he wasn't on an empty stomach.
No.
Just knocking back shots.
Totally.
So that's why.
Absolutely.
I just want, as I always do, I just want to throw that out there so people keep that in mind.
Yeah.
I think they maybe that the people of Strad Valley probably after this just chipped in and got the postman a bottle for Christmas.
Probably, yeah.
Get to send it home with them.
So actually, that brings up a good point. Let's talk about this a little bit. Larry lived in Kilmac, but his postman route was actually in Stradberry.
His
What's
postal
that?
route?
Postal route.
Yeah.
What did I say?
Postman route.
Oh.
I think it was actually, and he had some stops in between also, but I think.
But it was all in the Stradbally area.
Yeah, and so his house was about 6 miles or 10 kilometers away.
It was 8 miles. Stradbally is 8 miles away.
Oh, it is?
From Kilmac.
Oh.
And so
It's a long bicycle ride.
It's not so bad.
Well, it's not a marathon.
I mean, you can walk a mile in 20 minutes.
It all depends on whether it's like level or uphill, that kind of thing.
I think
downhill.
it's pretty level. Anyway, it doesn't really matter that much. What we know about Larry and what he did on that day is Christmas morning, he got up and went to Christmas Mass like most Catholics do. Then he delivered a few gifts to local families and kids that I think that his family was friends with. And then around noon, he put on his uniform, got on his standard issue bike, and took off for Strad Valley. He would have been expected back around 7 p.m., maybe a little later, depending on
what happened.
Depending on the nature of the evening, you know, drinking and eating and stuff like that. However, that night it started to snow. So when Mary, his aforementioned wife, saw that he just wasn't home and it was snowing, and she just kind of thought, well, he probably just stayed over in Strad Valley because
it's hard to ride a bicycle in the snow.
It is, and he had probably,
Yeah,
and she knew he had probably been drinking.
Yeah.
And he probably just said, you know, it's safer for me to just stay here than to make the trek back.
That's
so I'll
a
just stay the
logical
night.
thing to do.
Right.
Of course, boozing.
Yeah, and
changes
you know,
that.
this is pre-cell phone,
Yep.
so it's not as though he could have just picked up the phone and called her.
Probably didn't have a
She
phone
actually,
in the house.
yeah, probably didn't even have a phone in the house, and if it did, it was a party line and whatever. Anyway, she probably just said, whatever, he'll be home tomorrow morning after this all blows over. The next morning, however, at about 7 o'clock, I think it was, a man local to Strad Valley.
Is that a Stradballion?
I don't know, maybe.
Yeah.
He was walking on the road between Strad Valley and Kilmac and found a postman's bike laid carefully a few feet off the road. Larry...
Can I ask, what does the description, because I've always just seen laid carefully.
That is the description.
What do you think that means?
I think it
That is a
means
good
not
question.
haphazardly tossed and doesn't look like somebody had just
Crashed.
fallen off of it, that they had
Carefully
been
laid
walking
over.
it. Maybe they had been walking it and carefully laid it over on its side because it didn't have a kickstand.
Again,
maybe?
I never found a good description, so I was curious as to what the
I'm just making an assumption.
Okay.
And, you know, the thing is I would assume, given that it was a postman's bike, I would have assumed that it would have a kickstand on it.
I would assume so, yeah.
But
Maybe
they
not.
clearly didn't use it for this.
I don't know when the kickstand was invented.
I don't either.
This actually kind of makes
I think the kickstand was invented pretty early on when they had those stupid bicycles with the giant front and rear wheels. And the only way to park them was to stand them.
You just had a servant run behind you so he could hold the bike.
Yeah, that's actually sad.
But I kind of wonder if it stopped snowing early on and the snow turned to rain. Or if maybe because, otherwise you'd see tracks and stuff like that. Like, say, tracks, say if somebody rode the bike up or walked the bike up and then laid it down and then walked away and kept on going towards Kilmac or walked back towards Strad Valley.
I have no idea. There's no mention of any kind of tracks or anything like that, so I assume
it must
that
have
the
just
snow
stopped
kind
snowing.
of blew over. Yeah.
Must have.
Anyway,
Damn, too bad.
Larry was nowhere to be found and remains so to this day. The local man is unnamed, but he reported the bike to the police in Strad Valley, not in Kilmac. It's all local police is how it's always named. And I know that the police department that did the most of the investigation was based in Strad Valley, and I don't know if they also served Kilmac and other regions, but...
The Gardaí?
Yeah, but we're going to call them police officers because...
It's much easier.
Yeah, way easier. But so they were the first people to receive this report that the bike, and Larry, it's my understanding, was kind of the only postman that served that area, so they just thought, well, it's probably Larry's bike. I don't know if it had his name on it or something like that. It's possible.
It probably actually had some kind of number on
Maybe.
it because it's a postal issue. It's post office bike.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, I would imagine it's got something identifying it as a postal bike.
Well, it had his bags and like the saddle.
I just
and all
meant
that stuff.
Somewhere on it, almost like a license plate, kind of. Not necessarily a license plate, but something that would identify it.
I think in those days that wasn't as big
they
a
were
deal.
they were relaxed about that stuff in Ireland back in 1929.
Yeah. But either way, it doesn't really matter.
But he probably had his name like scratched into the, into his mailbag or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, so the police decided, well, we're going to do a search. I have seen reports that there were police and postmen and a bunch of
local farmers,
civilians, almost 100 people or more were looking for Larry that day, on the day after Christmas Day, which in Ireland is St. Stephen's Day.
My favorite day, because it's my day. I'm a
good
state
point.
on that day.
Some other Steve
You mean
who
you're
was
a saint?
Yeah.
Not a state.
You know what? I'm in a state on that day, which makes me a saint.
Yeah.
Oh, kinds of hungover. But yeah, apparently
Between Strad Valley and Kilmac is mostly marshlands.
with bogs.
With big bogs.
Nasty
and
little bogs that you can fall into.
If you've listened to our, for instance, Tunguska episode, you know those bogs can be quite deep often. People initially kind of thought that maybe in his drunken state he'd accidentally fallen in, so they started looking in that area, but there was no trace of him at all anywhere. When they couldn't find Larry on the 26th, the investigators, the police department there, decided that maybe they should report this to their higher-ups. So they did. They called Chief Superintendent Harry O'Mara to let him know that Larry had gone missing.
He was from Waterford, right?
He was based out of Waterford, yeah, which I guess would have been the local head brass office.
Yeah, maybe that was the county seat or something like that. It was Waterford County, right?
Yeah.
So
his first act was to travel to Strad Valley to question the police who had been investigating, and they were named. Officers DeLay, Frawley, Murphy, and Sullivan. They are the main named police officers. They might have actually been the only.
And that is an entire bunch of Irish names right there.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I think actually they were the only police officers in that area at the time.
And they were all based right there in Strad Valley, where our postman was last seen.
Yeah. Frawley was married, and so he lived actually above the post office in Strad Valley, not in Kilmac.
Not in Kilmac, yeah.
But the others lived in an officer's barracks, so they were allowed to, I don't know, whatever. They all denied seeing Larry leave the village, and also all of them, particularly DeLay, claimed that Larry was sober. I do love that the officers were like, no, we didn't see Larry. We didn't see him, but we know he was sober.
I know.
He was definitely sober.
Yeah.
So that's cool.
It's kind of funny when your worst witnesses in the case happen to be the local police.
Yeah, that is actually kind of what happened here.
Yeah.
Other people from Strad Valley said that Larry was quote-unquote a bit jolly, a.k.a. drunk.
Yeah.
While he was investigating, O'Mara was also able to establish that Larry had not made it to the houses at the end of his route, which were on the road back to Kilmac, nor was his bike on the road at 4 a.m. when a different local man was walking along the road, presumably back to his house from the town.
This is Christmas at 4 a.m.?
It's the day after Christmas.
Okay, my
people
point
have
is,
jobs, you know?
But at 4 a.m. in an area that probably doesn't have street lighting, it's really freaking dark.
Yeah, it would have been easy to could have missed the bike, yeah.
But I'm amazed that they grabbed onto this. It couldn't have been there at this time because this guy didn't notice it.
Well, so, yeah, that's fair, certainly. I'm inclined to believe that the conclusions that O'Mara was able to draw from his investigations were by and large correct. But it's totally fair to say we don't know the situation. You know, there weren't streetlights, right? But we don't know if by that point the moon had come out and it was glowing off of the snow and it was super bright, and he was able to say no with absolute certainty the bike was. You know, we don't know.
Okay.
But so the timeline then becomes sometime between 4 a.m. and 7:30 a.m. Larry's bike made it a few miles out of town. And if
self-driving bike.
At this point you aren't suspicious about something, you are far behind where O'Mara was at, because he started to become very suspicious.
Oh.
Pretty much
a lot of people.
Yeah.
You know who else was suspicious?
Us.
Yeah, well, us. Yeah, but the local priest actually, he was like going all Father Brown on these guys.
He was actually. Yeah, we're about to talk about that.
We'll talk about that. Yeah.
Actually, right now we're going to talk.
Oh,
about
are we?
that.
Okay.
Yeah. So O'Mara continued to investigate because he just kind of thought, there was something weird going on.
About?
Yeah. On January 6th, a local priest named Father O'Shea told O'Mara that he should question a 16-year-old boy from Strad Valley named John Power. Seems that the father had likely heard a confession from John that made him think that the Strad Valley police might be covering something up. Turns out, probably.
Maybe.
Dun, dun, dun. O'Mara set up an interview with young John Powers at a different police station that didn't include our named officers.
Yeah, see, already he's not trusting these guys.
Yeah.
Go figure.
What he told O'Mara was actually very different than the story that the police officers had told him about that night. He told them that he had witnessed a set of events on Christmas Day night, and that there were 3 other people with him that night who could corroborate his story. His story was basically that he had been standing outside the window of Whelan's pub with these three other men, who we'll talk about in a second.
Oh, and by the way, sorry to interrupt you,
no,
but
go ahead.
I just want to say, if you get on Google Street View and go to Strad Valley, there's like a center part of town, like a crossroads right there. There's a little almost town square-ish, kind of like a little parkish thing right there. And you'll see all these places that are referenced here. The Whelan's Pub is like right there in the corner.
It's still operational.
Yeah, and then
still open.
And then right next to it is the post office, which Garda policeman Frowley lived above.
Yep.
And then the hall is like to the right and across the street, and,
and
the police barracks is next door to that.
Yeah.
It's like
the
all
Irish
right
don't
there.
throw anything away.
No.
Yeah,
It's all still there.
It is all there, exactly the same.
Probably in pretty much the same condition.
Just about, but
probably a little updating, but
so
yeah, that's
if any
true.
of this stuff confuses you, just
go ahead
check
and
it out. Yeah.
just go check it out. Yeah, because I kind of just assumed people would look it up. I didn't spend a lot of time kind of describing. The story that John Powers told was that he had been standing outside the window of Whelan's pub and with the other 3 men from 6 p.m. on Christmas Day, and then they had seen Larry and Officer Dulé outside the post office at 6:30, and then they walked past them and around the corner. Officer Dulé was pushing a bike, and Larry appeared to be really drunk and sick. Well, sorry, the quote is trying to empty the contents of his stomach.
Well,
should we make the sound effect?
Nope.
No, probably
Let's
should
not. Yeah. Power said that he remained outside Whelan's for another hour, and he did not see Dulé or Larry again. So, based on this testimony, evidence, whatever it is,
Superintendent O'Mara.
O'Mara, of course, goes back to question DeLay again. And DeLay says at this point, basically, well, yeah, okay, fine, yes, I was with Larry that night. But he was definitely totally sober, and I didn't tell you about it because, I didn't lie about it because, I didn't tell you about it because I just didn't think it was important.
Oh, it really wasn't, I'm sure.
He literally, the quote attributed to him is that he said that it was of no consequence, that he had actually seen Larry on the night that he disappeared. Just, that wasn't important.
No consequence at all.
Sure, of course not, right. To which anyone with a brain, of course, would say, well, clearly you are hiding something. More on this later. O'Mara continued to investigate. And, the story around this is really hazy because there's a lot of conflicting accounts of things.
This is my least favorite kind of story because everybody is contradicting each other and changing their story.
And themselves, yeah. Pretty much anytime anybody was interviewed, their story changed substantially.
These guys did not get together and get their stories all lined
Clearly
up.
not.
But even the locals, they would talk to locals, and it seemed like their stories would shift.
We're going to talk
Yeah.
about that in a little bit, actually. There's some pretty compelling testimony that they thought they could get a conviction on that later, when they called that person
fell through the floor.
Yeah, they called them into to testify in court, and they were like, totally different story. So we'll talk about that in a second. But this haze is we're trying to clear it away a little bit. And this is just one of many. It seems to be pretty much accepted by both the research that I did. It seems to be the most consistent story, and reading around the internet, people pretty much agree this is kind of the most consistent stuff. But again, it's all changes a million times. So the people who lived in Strad Valley were able to solidify the story that it sounds like about after 6 p.m. a clearly drunk Larry had visited Officer Frawley's flat, the one that's above the post office. Right
next door to Whelan's Pub. That one.
Yeah, and he had apparently showed up with Officer Dulé, where all of them had some more alcohol, more being an operative term here.
I suspect that's what they did all day on Christmas in that town.
That's what I do all day, and I have a lot of other stuff going on.
There's not much going on in that town otherwise, really.
Yeah, and from there, the 3 men went outside, and the officers, in their clearly sober state, decided that Larry was too drunk to go home. So apparently Officer Frawley went to Whelan's to see if they could let him stay there for the night, sleep it off, whatever. But he realized that he had been followed into Whelan's by Sergeant Cullinane.
Yeah.
Apparently Cullinane sounds like the actual, what's the word I'm thinking about? The actual...
Sergeant?
Well,
the guy in charge?
Guy in charge, but he sounds like he was the law and order guy in the crowd there among the local police, and so it might have been...
was the one that followed, was by the book.
Well, I think that DeLay realized, oh my God, he's following me into the pub. I better turn around and back right out again because there's people in the pub.
Yeah. So from there, apparently, Officer Dulé took Larry around the corner, which would have been, I guess, when John and his friends saw Larry with Dulé.
Because there was a back door into the pub,
There was a back door into the pub,
Yeah.
and they both went into Whelan's by the back door, and then neither of them were seen to leave again. This, of course, was all news to O'Mara.
Because this version of the story had not been presented to him yet.
Which was a problem because he had interviewed the police officers now not once but twice, and had not heard this story from any of them. So that was probably a problem.
Yeah, these guys are not supposed to do this. Of course, this was the early days of what we call organized policing,
And it wasn't very organized?
Well, and it was
really.
early days for the Irish Republic as well.
Yeah.
So that might have...
Played part of it?
Yeah, they were not quite as professional in those days.
So pretty much it's accepted that Larry was at Whelan's that night drinking, and that the police officers were probably a little bit involved in his disappearance, whether explicitly caused it or at least they had seen him on that night, and clearly they were trying to cover something up because they kept saying no, he was sober, or we just didn't even see him. There are a few other details that I want to add, but I actually want to just incorporate those into theories or suspects or whatever we're going to do.
Or hypotheses?
Yeah, whatever
we're calling that today?
Yeah. So let's get into that.
Okay.
But first, let's take a break.
Is this the point where we break out the Guinness?
Yeah.
What do the Holy Grail, Nefertiti's tomb, and Michael Rockefeller have in common? They're gone. But what happened? Where'd they go? If you're a fan of this podcast, you probably want to know. So join the search for the answer in Gone, a new mystery podcast that dives deep into the past to explore historical